This is lecture number 25 in the ABCs of Communism. And today's focus is on the fight for communism in Brazil. You'll recall that the last time we were here, we were talking about the fight for communism in Argentina, which is immediately to the south of Brazil, as most of you know. And it's separated from Brazil by the La Plata River and then an estuary, which is almost an ocean in itself. But at any rate, one of the things you want to keep in mind here is that if you are able to speak one of these languages, Spanish in the case of the countries that surround Brazil, or Portuguese in the case of Brazil, you're also able to speak the other language. This was brought home clear to me not too many years ago when I was in Leticia, Colombia, and they had two TV stations there. One was in Portuguese and one was in Spanish. Now, the Portuguese station came from Tabatinga, which was the Brazilian side of the city of Leticia, and the Spanish station, of course, came from Leticia. But people, I quickly realized from visiting homes on both sides of the border, watched one set of telenovelas as quickly as they watched another set. That is not something new. This has been something that's been going on between Brazilians and Spaniards for many generations, and it goes back to these early days. But I want to start out here, even before that, with a discussion of primitive communism in Brazil. Why? Well, we had to cut out the first few minutes of the Argentina tape on primitive communism because it was fluttering too much. And besides that, it didn't really make that much difference because there wasn't that much to report that was new earlier than 10 to 11,000 year old sites in Argentina, which are in your book, and you can read about them to the degree that you wish. The really new information that affects this part of the world comes from Brazil. So we're going to start there this morning. We have a couple of sites which date very, very early in Brazil. In fact, they are the earliest sites anywhere in the New World. The first of them comes from a place called Pedra Furada, which means pierced rock. It's an important collection of over 800 archaeological sites. It includes numerous rock paintings. A Brazilian and a French team excavated a site in the southeastern portion of the state of Piauí in what is now the Serra de Capivara National Park. Discovered the site in '73. Discovery was reported by the Brazilian archaeologist Nide Guidon, who published her findings in 1986. This is well after, of course, I went to graduate school, and needless to say, well after the time I was an undergraduate. In those years, as an undergraduate, there was a general disdain for archaeology and paleontology done in both Argentina and Brazil. Especially the focus was on Argentina in those days, because they were reporting very early dinosaurs of enormous size. And paleontologists, from whom I took historical geology, for example, and Pleistocene and vertebrate paleontology, just made fun of this business. Like, these are guys that are pretending to be scientists, but they obviously don't know what they're talking about. Well, in the interim period, of course, it would be hard to find a Discovery Channel show that doesn't have something about dinosaurs in Argentina. We know there are some of the biggest dinosaurs that ever lived are coming out of Argentina. And they seem to be just as inaccurate about the archaeology down there. But the best example of this archaeology now comes from Brazil. One of them is this Pedra Furada site that is in 1872. And here we have carbon dates right down to 32,000 years ago. And a repeated analysis of these carbon dates pushes that date back to 60,000 years ago. And archaeological levels that are well excavated yield dates between 32,000 and 17,000 years on levels above that. And here we have Stone Age artifacts that include darts and atlatls, but no arrows or bows. Now, this doesn't surprise me at all. I've mentioned to you before that in 1969 we took an expedition to the Stikine and Tahltan River in northern British Columbia, and although the most important sites we excavated there were microblade sites, which were clearly related to northern Japan and northern China, as I demonstrated in my doctoral dissertation. There was one site which we excavated which was completely outside of this parameter altogether. Well, I recall that we were sitting on a point bar where there was a fish house that Taltan Indians of the historic period had used to smoke salmon, and it was on the Taltan River. Now, when you sit there at a table and look up at the side of the cliff, which the road went past us and then wound up the side of the cliff till it got to a plateau, after which you went in a kind of half-assed straight line to what was then called Dease Lake, still is called Dease Lake, but was the first connection to a real highway, although it was not paved. And anyhow, that I'm sitting there looking at that site, and I thought, you know, those rose bushes are actually covering up an ancient land surface. We ought to go up there and test it, because whatever is on that land surface is much later than the sites that we've already been excavating, which we had a rough idea were going to date somewhere between 9,500 years and 15,000 years ago. So several of us went up there and we cut down those rose bushes and we pulled all those huge boulders out of the way. Sometimes we had to tie a rope onto them. Got down to the old land surface and started putting a test pit and then a couple around it. And what do you know? We came right down on a fireplace, right down on a bunch of tools sitting in and on that fireplace. And so these tools were completely different. First of all, there wasn't anything made of obsidian, where everything else we'd excavated was made of obsidian from Mount Edzizat. Now these were made of different kinds of basalt, and first of all, they looked extremely crude compared to the beautiful tools that we'd been excavating made of obsidian. And all of this made me think, this is a much earlier land surface. That means this is a much earlier site that's been covered up here. How much earlier, I don't know. And whether we can get any kind of date out of these, what's remnant charcoal here, I kind of doubt, because all of a sudden, well, you see on these, you have lots of rainfall, lots of snowfall, and lots of precipitation leaching through the soil profile, and that's going to bring in a constant amount of new carbon to be deposited right alongside your, or right inside your charcoal. So, as I recall, we didn't do any dating, carbon dating successfully there. But what we had was a clear-cut artifacts in a surface which were of a different type. I mentioned this in my doctoral dissertation, and later Valerie Harrison and I wrote a short note for Journal of Field Archaeology on this particular site. But I never got it out of my mind. And I could realize by this time, within a few years, that what we had there was probably the remnant of a very early migration, which either moved across the Bering Land Bridge, or, following Knut Fladmark's thesis, were island hopping people who made it all the way from Hokkaido or northern China, Kamchatka, into along the Aleutian Islands and then down the coast of British Columbia, or both of these ways, probably both. At any rate, we had a remnant of the very first migration there. That's what I thought at the time, and I haven't changed my mind since then. For those of you who want to see how I arranged some of this stuff, you'll remember that we have this article. I wrote an article in a volume published in '82 called Peopling of the New World, edited by Jonathan Erickson and published at that time by Bellina Press. I see there's still some copies available of the printed edition. So I think that from that earliest migration, the projectile point traditions we call fish-tailed or Magelloid from the east, from the west coast of South America, the Lerma bipoint laurel leaf tradition which emerges in Venezuela about the same time as the Magelloid points do down in South America, and the fluted point traditions, which have their earliest manifestations in the U.S. Southwest in Arizona and New Mexico, and which get younger as they go east and north. So that was an idea that's been in my mind for many years and goes back to that very early excavation in 1969. Well, now we have real evidence for both of these phases of migration in Brazil, and that's about as much as I'm going to say about it right now. For those of you who are really interested, you certainly can go to the book and take a look at pages in that chapter at the second and third pages. Well, what I'm going to do after that is skip up to one of the most important new sets of discoveries that have been made in Brazil also. And this has to do with the discovery of a stage of advanced theocratic chiefdoms in the eastern Amazon rainforest. Now, how did we get to find these? Well, the original way was that there's been so much deforestation of the Brazilian Amazon from countless numbers of millions of people that have been moving out of the industrial centers. This is especially true before the new Workers' Party regime took over about 12 years ago. Since then, that migration has slowed down considerably for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is the government now sends a check to everybody every week, and of course this takes some of the pressure off. If you were starving and you had no other alternative but to go to the rainforest, and that's what you would have to do, but that has decreased rapidly. But by the time it did start to decrease, huge sections of the eastern part of the Amazon had been deforested, and what that meant was that ground features could be photographed, seen from the air. So what did they see? Well, one of the most amazing things here is that we have structures which are the equivalent of the Nazca lines, for example, and the wall rock art of northern Chile that are called geoglyphs. We have those right there, and you can see them very clearly. Some of the experts that have done research on this believe that there's more labor involved in the construction of one of these temples, which is what I think it is, of advanced theocratic chiefdom stage, than was involved in the construction of the Cheops pyramid in Egypt. Well, I've gone through those in great detail, but what you have here is a completely new picture, therefore, of the Amazon. Now, some North Americans made an attempt to see whether that eastern Amazon went into the western Amazon, and they conducted a auger survey extending from Manaus, which you know is halfway up the Amazon River in Brazil, down to Rondônia, I believe, which is a mountainous part of Brazil on the other side of the Amazon. But the problem with that study is these are 18-inch cores, and that's nothing. 18 inches in the Amazon, you could get that much deposition in 1 year. I know, because I've spent some time out there. I wasn't doing archaeology, but I've spent some time out there. Now, the important thing here is that they did find huge swaths of charcoal. Now, fires don't just start and burn spontaneously there like they do in the Rocky Mountains, for example, because every day you have a huge rainfall. So to start a fire and maintain it for any distance whatsoever requires humans to tend it. And so all that distance from Manaus to Rondônia, they find charcoal, big burned layers of charcoal, which means humans were doing it. And 18 inches, it picks up that much already, and the fact that they didn't pick up any known crop phytoliths, as they call them, doesn't mean much either. Remember, the only thing that can survive out there in terms of pollen grain structure is cellulose, and anything less than that is going to be disintegrated. So to do this study right, you would have to go to as deep as you could with your auger for many tens of feet or meters, as the case may be, and you would have to be prepared to clean this material up properly to try and find the cellulose remnants of the tiny little cells we call sex cells or spores that plants produce. Now, I happen to have taken a whole year of palynology when I was in graduate school, so I'm pretty familiar with what needs to be done to clean up these samples, and had some success, which I won't go into now, in new discoveries that were made for Len Hills at the time, who was doing the work for an oil company and teaching our course, and there were only 4 of us, I believe, in that palynology course for the year, so we got a lot of attention. And I think I know what I'm talking about when I say that that study that was done doesn't mean anything. It's interesting to me that the State Department, however, pushed that study, and I was trying to figure out why would they give a damn. And pretty soon it dawned on me, but not until recently actually, when I found out that the Brazilian government had taken Edward Snowden's warnings to heart and had organized a Amazon defense team of its army. I think they have 5 battalions out there as we speak, conducting a defense against U.S. imperialist invasion out there. Well, one justification for such an invasion might be that, well, Brazil was never a united country anyway, and we're going to support the Sao Paulo Republic. I know that they've been busy trying to subvert Sao Paulo by taking advantage of some of the local problems they're having with water supply and with indigenous tribes. Whatever way they can find to intervene in Brazil, they're going to do it. And the Brazilian government has finally figured this out too. They were the #1 target for NSA spying in South America. Okay, well, what does that have to do with our primitive communism? Very little. Very little, except to say that what in the western Amazon we have yet to find out is what actually happened out there preceding the advanced theocratic chiefdoms that we can now see in the eastern Amazon because of the deforestation. There isn't going to be very much more deforestation in the Amazon because the Brazilian government has taken on a completely new program, and whatever you saw out there to begin with is going to change rather radically. And there's a difference between poverty-stricken former would-be industrial workers in Rio or Sao Paulo flocking into the countryside and people that have come out there and actually successfully built a farm. Well, they're not going to keep burning, slashing and burning and moving on. They're going to stay with their farms, and they're going to take care of their local environment. So all of this destruction of the Amazon rainforest is coming to an end. Okay. I could give you more of the details of these structures. I might, but you can read them all on the 5th and 6th pages of this chapter. What I'm going to do now is skip up to the time of white contact in Brazil, which is to say when the Portuguese arrived. Now you remember that the Pope, Borgia, who had taken the name Alexander VI, I believe, had divided the world between the 2 papist powers, Spain and Portugal. And everything east of the line that he used to divide the world was given to Portugal. And that included everything in the Old World and the Portuguese promontory, the Brazilian promontory that juts out past that line. And everything to the west of that line was given to Spain, which is to say all of the New World. And that's where things had stood when the Portuguese arrived in 1500. The natives were living mainly on the coast and along the banks of the major rivers. Tribal warfare, cannibalism, the pursuit of Brazil wood for its treasured red dye convinced the Portuguese that they should begin their colonization by imposing their religion on the natives. This is something that, of course, the Catholics always do. To get a good example of it in modern literature, I like to see that you will recall in the book, in the movie Shogun, that Mr. Clavel shows the role of the Catholic Church has been playing in subverting the local people and making them susceptible to colonization by the papist powers. Same thing happened everywhere that the papist powers were operating, and that includes now Brazil. Where did Brazil get its name? From this Brazil wood, which is the Latin for this was pau Brazil, which means wood that's red like an ember, or Brazil wood. And that's where the country of Brazil gets its name originally. Okay, the Brazil wood is a large tree, and its trunk yields a prized red dye. It was almost wiped out after Portuguese contact from overexploitation. Now, until 1529, however, that is in the first 3 decades after contact, Portugal had very little interest in Brazil, mainly due to the high profits gained through their commerce with India, China, and Indonesia. This lack of interest allowed traders, pirates, and privateers of several countries to poach profitable Brazil wood in lands claimed by Portugal. So the Portuguese crown devised a system to effectively occupy Brazil without having to pay the costs. And they called this the captaincy system, where Brazil was divided into strips of land that were donated to Portuguese noblemen. The theory of the thing was that those granted these captaincies were to be responsible for the occupation of the territory and the administration of the land, and they would answer directly to the King of Portugal. The system was a failure. Only 4 lots were successfully occupied, those being in Pernambuco, Sao Paulo, Ilhas, Porto Seguro. The captaincies gradually reverted to the crown, becoming provinces and eventually states of the Brazilian nation. Starting in the 1500s, sugarcane grown on latifunias along the northeast coast became the base of Brazilian economy and society, and these latifundias were run on slave labor, turning sugarcane to make rum for export to Europe. Now, the Portuguese had brought so many diseases with them that they had been able to wipe out most of the indigenous population. And what that meant was they had a relatively fewer number of people they could enslave and put on the plantations. Now, in Argentina, this had been a different story for reasons that we already have gone through, but there was a constant need in Brazil for an importation of slaves from Africa, and that never happened in Argentina. So there's a big difference beginning to develop right there in terms of the way contact went on. Now, there were so few of the indigenous peoples left after the initial 1500s first few decades conquest that the colonist landowners soon began the importation of millions of slaves from Africa. Mortality rates for super-exploited, overworked slaves and sugar and gold enterprises were so dramatic that there were not enough females to replenish the slave population. If you've seen that movie Django Unchained, then you can think of Candyland plantation and think of it transposed to all of Brazil, and you got a pretty good picture of the conditions that these blacks lived under. So that slave trade did not come to an end until 1888, very late, 50 years after the British finally got rid of their part of it. At any rate, accordingly, Africans became a substantial section of Brazilian population, and long before the end of slavery in 1888, they had begun to merge with the European population of Brazil. During the first 150 years of the colonial period, attracted by vast natural resources and untapped land, other European businessmen and their governments tried to establish colonies in several parts of Portugal's Brazilian territory. This was, of course, in defiance of Pope Rodrigo Borgia, Alexander VI's division of the globe between the two great papist powers of Spain and Portugal. French colonists tried to settle in present-day Rio de Janeiro from 1555 to 1567, and present-day São Luís from 1612 to 1614. However, Portuguese Jesuits arrived early and established Sao Paulo, evangelizing the natives and turning them into military allies for the use of the Portuguese army in attacking and driving out the French. So, the unsuccessful Dutch intrusion into Brazil was longer lasting and more troublesome to Portugal. The Dutch privateers began by plundering the coast. They sacked Bahia in 1604. They temporarily captured the capital city of Salvador. From 1630 to 1654, the Dutch set up more permanently in the northeast and controlled a long stretch of coast most accessible to Europe, without, however, penetrating the interior. The colonists of the Dutch West India Company in Brazil were in a constant state of siege in spite of the presence of Recife, of the pirate of John Maurice of Nassau as governor. After several years of open warfare, the Dutch withdrew in 1654. Now, we're going to skip up to the Napoleonic Wars and what that meant for Brazil. The Napoleonic Wars will lead to Brazil's liberation. In 1808, the Portuguese court in Lisbon, fleeing from Napoleon's invasion of Portugal during the Peninsular War, was escorted by a large British fleet to Brazil, which was at that time their big colony. There they established themselves in the city of Rio de Janeiro. And from there the Portuguese king ruled his huge empire for 15 years. In fact, he would have remained for the rest of his life in Rio if it were not for the social turmoil caused in Portugal due to the influx of French revolutionary ideas along with Bonaparte's troops. The king's long stay in Brazil after the end of Napoleon's reign naturally raised the question even more acutely among the working masses as to why Portugal should have a monarchy at all. One step ahead of the Bonapartist invasion in 1815, Portugal's king escaped Iberia for Brazil. When he returned in 1821, he left his elder son Pedro behind as his regent for Brazil. 1 year later, the boy Pedro declared the secession of Brazil from his father's Portugal and led a war against him. His new title was Emperor Pedro I of Brazil. However, this boy fell out of favor with the ruling families of Brazil as he left for Portugal. He left behind his 5-year-old son as Emperor Pedro II, and the country was ruled by regents approved by Brazil's huge landowning ruling families between 1831 and 1840. This was a period of many rebellions. And after this period, Pedro II was declared of age. Pedro II held a parliamentary reign which lasted until 1889, 1 year after the abolition of slavery. He was ousted by a coup d'etat in 1889, and that created the Republic of Brazil. Brazil's latifundista mines and agricultural plantations were totally dependent on servile labor of the slave variety. Accordingly, the British ruling families realized that to take Brazil away from the Portuguese slavocrats, they needed to abolish the slave trade. This was the major reason why the Brit rulers made the United Kingdom and its end in the participation of the Atlantic slave trade obsolete and outlawed it. Therefore, the Brits involved themselves in the wars fought in the region of the La Plata River, which we just discussed, that huge estuary. It's more like an ocean between Argentina and Brazil and Uruguay. This was the Cisplatine War in the second half of the 1820s, the Platine War in the 1850s, the Uruguayan War and the Paraguayan War in the 1860s, and this last war against Paraguay was also the bloodiest and most expensive in South American history. All right, so the Brits got themselves involved in that because what they're really trying to do is to get control of Portugal's Brazilian territory. Pedro II was overthrown on November 15, 1889, as we've said, by a Republican military coup led by General Fonseca. Fonseca became the country's first de facto president through military ascension. The country's name became the Republic of the United States of Brazil. The two military presidents ruled through 4 years of dictatorship amid conflicts among the military and political elites, which included 2 naval revolts, followed by a Federalist revolt, and an economic crisis caused by the burst of a great financial bubble, one of those like we're having today. At any rate, from 1889 to 1930, the country was then ruled by a military dictatorship with the form of a constitutional democracy. It was kind of a combination of what the United States looked like before the Civil War, in the sense that you had completely different social systems operating in the southern states than you did in the northern states. And that's about the best comparison I can give you for that particular moment. The first Republican Constitution was created in 1891, just 3 years after the abolition of slavery. Women and the illiterate majority of the population were denied the right to vote. The dictatorship called itself a form of presidentialism. It adopted the North American form of government and in a form and divided it into three powers: legislative, executive, and judiciary. The presidential term was fixed at 4 years, and direct voting was only by wealthy, white, landed men. So that was their idea of democracy. Kind of like exactly what existed in the United States with the Articles of Confederation and then the first constitutional form. After 1894, the presidency of the Republic was occupied by coffee farmers, or oligarchies, from Sao Paulo and Minas Gerais, these two big states. This policy was called the coffee and milk policy. The election for president and governors was ruled by the governor's policy, in which they had mutual support to ensure the election of some candidates. The exchanges of favors also happened among politicians, and big landowners, and they used the power to control the votes of the population in return for favors. Great changes occurred after the 1888 abolition of slavery, especially during the last decade of the 1800s. In 1887, literacy in Brazil was still only about 45% of the population, and that's a very generous estimate. The majority of Brazilians during this period still lived in the country's vast interior. Now everything changed when massive immigration from southern Europe took place. Now you will recall that this is the same time it's happening in Argentina, in the Buenos Aires, Entre Rios provinces. The same thing is beginning to happen. Over 10 million Europeans entered South America from 1870s until World War I began in 1914. Out of that 10 million, 3.4 million entered Brazil between 1871 and 1920. Most of these immigrants arrived in the first decades of the 20th century. This massive wave of immigration fueled the growth of capitalist Brazil by providing the manpower for industrialization. Along the way, these immigrant workers formed one of the world's largest anarchist-controlled labor forces. Therefore, anarchism helped shape the history of Brazil. Now, you'll recall that these workers are coming largely from Spain and northern Italy, which is precisely where the anarchists had their biggest bases at the time that Karl Marx confronted them. And Marx had found that the only way to handle the anarchist problem was to get the First International Congress out of their reach. So he sent it to Philadelphia. Well, these are the same kinds of workers that we Marxists had been confronting in Europe. They're now flooding to South America. So what the political organizations that they know from back home are anarchists at home. So it's not surprising that they would bring the anarchism with them into Brazil. Anarcho-syndicalism, as it's sometimes called, brought a new lease on life with this flood of immigrants around the turn of the century. Why the term anarcho-syndicalism? Well, they were anarchists to begin with, and syndicalists are those who believe that they can organize workers in factories to take control of those factories, and that by having done that, they will overthrow the capitalist system. They differ from us, that is from Marxists or communists, in that we've always said, no, you're going to overthrow the capitalist system, you have to confront their state apparatus. You have to confront their army and police with our army and police, and you have to kill them before they can kill us. End of story. Well, syndicalism in effect is a way of saying we're going to avoid that. These are guys who are not anxious to get out on armed strikes or in an actual shootout for state power. anarchism and syndicalism are kind of natural allies in this sense. So that's why we now use the term anarcho-syndicalism in our discussion of Brazilian immigration. So anarcho-syndicalism brought a new lease on life with this flood of immigrants around the turn of the century. Brazilian organized labor grew in the industrial cities along the coast. Initially, this radical movement grew with the anarchist passion of the southern European immigrants. The ruling classes reacted with severe repression via both their state and church. However, anarchism was the single largest force behind Brazilian labor for the first 2 decades of the new century. After 1917, news of the Bolshevik Revolution coincided with the arrival of Marxist-oriented workers in Brazil as it had in Argentina. Now in a moment we're going to discuss the spread of telegraphy across Brazil. And that is because prior to oil becoming the predominant thread that we want to follow in the evolution of the capitalist stage, it's the telegraph that you want to follow, which is the primary technological innovation of the pre-Civil War in the U.S. period. And it's also the same way in South America. After 1888, the wealthiest families in Brazil wanted to get into the world capitalist economy, and for this reason they decided to flood the nation with immigrants. Original immigrants had been brought into Brazil to work the country's numerous coffee plantations. These new immigrants soon found the near slave conditions so oppressive they just kept on moving. And you remember that when we talked about people trying to escape being unfree in North America in our first few chapters on the American labor movement, we pointed out that most of these people that came to the New World were unfree. And I don't mean just the obvious ones that were unfree, like the chattel slave blacks in the southern colonies. But all of these people that came over here on 5 to 7 year apprenticeships that came to the northern cities were not very happy with that condition either. They had a different alternative. The blacks in the South couldn't run away and find any comfort in the countryside, because the countryside, to the degree that it had population, was white. On the other hand, the unfree white workers from Scotland, England, Germany, whatever, who came over here as indentured servants with 5 to 7 year contracts to pay for their transit, they could easily run away to major cities like New York, Philadelphia, and there at Boston, and there they could hide among the white population, and so they had that alternative. The same thing was happening in Brazil. As soon as these people get over there, these are workers who were relatively well paid back home in Italy and Spain when they had jobs, and who had technical skills, and they didn't come to Brazil in order to be chattel slaves. So once they got there and they found that things were so bad that they were expected to live in small rooms, 10 by 10 by 18 feet, with 4 to 6 people in a room, sanitation conditions for the poorest of Sao Paulo being 1 toilet for 20 people, and for the next 10% poorest people had 1 toilet for every 100 to 200 people. Well, you can imagine that this shock, this is not something they're going to accept very easily, and they didn't, so they started to take off. Now, industrially, Brazil rapidly became a textile center for South America. The port cities of Santos and Rio de Janeiro shipped much of Brazil's coffee and rubber overseas to European and Asian American markets. Brazil's ruling class still operated as if they were in a slave economy, demanding sun-up to sundown labor both in the fields and in the factories. With a developing industrial economy and a massive interior filled with natural resources, Brazil was making itself one of South America's leading economic centers. Now, 1914, World War I comes and it cuts off Brazil from European trading partners. Accordingly, the nation was forced to develop itself industrially to make up for what could not be imported from Europe or America anymore. Therefore, a startling growth of Brazil's leading city at that time, Sao Paulo, occurred overnight. For example, in 1900, Sao Paulo had 240,000 people and 22,500 buildings. After the First World War, in 1918 was over, the population and the buildings doubled from 250,000 to 500,000 in people and 22,000 to 55,000 buildings respectively in Sao Paulo. Why was this? Well, because there's not much coming from Europe, if anything at all. So whatever you're going to produce, you're going to have to do it locally at whatever cost. And you're going to have to employ workers and pay them properly. So all of this happened during the First World War for Brazil. But Brazilian government and industry were corrupt organizations who served only the interest of those in power. And as the end of the war came, the interest of those in power changed. Newly arrived immigrants saw a system of ruling class dictatorship with a corrupt relationship between government and industry, and the anarchists knew that capitalist society was always based on human exploitation and violence, and they rejected the whole system as beyond redemption. The popularity of anarchism for Brazil's immigrant working class had its basis, as we've already seen, in Iberian Portugal as well as Spain and northern Italy. Fraud, violence, and control, backed by landed oligarchs, were the normal rule in South America as well as Iberia. Many Brazilian workers accordingly came to believe that direct industrial action was preferable to political action as the only way to improve their status. This is exactly the same position as the anarchists had in Iberia and northern Italy. Brazilian capital is in general agreement with the anarchists. Brazilian capitalists preferred immigrant labor over that of Brazilians. They considered anything European superior over anything Brazilian, and including and especially in the labor force. This xenophobic racism fed into the anarchist desire to exclude Brazilian workers from the political process. Original Brazilian workers were out of the political question. That is, the guys that had already been over there long before the immigration started. As far as capitalists were concerned, they didn't want any of them at all. And this was fine with anarchism that wanted all workers, original and newly immigrated, excluded from the political process. Of the 3.4 million immigrants who flooded into Brazil, the majority were from Italy, 1.4 million. The Portuguese made the second largest group of nearly 1 million. Spanish immigrants were next as numerous at 500,000. These new workers were mostly under anarchist influence and made easy allies with the original Brazilian labor force, excluded by the capitalists of Brazil anyway. So, German, Polish, Jewish, Russian, and Danish immigrants all moved to Brazil in less sizable numbers. Many of them, including the Russians, were under the influence of anarchism, and others soon found the anarchist labor organizations were their only protective mechanism. By far, the majority of the Italian immigrants hailed from the countryside and cities of northern Italy, where a firm anarchist labor tradition had been in place for a generation, as we've already mentioned several times. As mentioned above, many of these immigrants skipped the cities and moved into the Brazilian countryside to find even worse conditions. Trichinosis, for example, which is, as you probably know, comes about from a trichina worm that infects pork, and if you don't cook the pig sufficiently, you're going to get trichinosis. So that infected 305,000 people in 1905 just on the coffee plantations of rural Sao Paulo. As the European immigrants flooded into the cities, establishing sugar plantations, working Brazilians have been forced to move from the northern cities regions to the urban centers of the south. It was immigrants who made up the industrial and urban workforces. Accordingly, they were forced into the anarcho-syndicalist movement. One reason for the popularity of anarchism, as we have seen, was that few immigrants had any desire to become Brazilian citizens. Anarchists preached against citizenship. According to anarchist theory, workers of the world were a class independent of national boundaries. They interpreted this to mean that loyalty to any nation, including the Brazilian polity, was just another cap trick. By 1920, only 6,441, or 1.5%, of the 445,000 foreigners in Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro had become Brazilian citizens. The Brazilian immigrant, therefore, existed outside the traditional political system. Government was something removed to them, something distant. Anarchism was a political philosophy that actually encouraged its supporters to live outside of the traditional political spectrum. Conversely, socialist petty bourgeois reform parties in Brazil always encouraged their followers to become citizens, register to vote, and then elect them into positions of power. Anarchism, on the other hand, made no such request of its adherents. In fact, exactly the opposite. It was the relative few demands that anarchism prescribed for its followers that made it so popular. Anarchism simply asked for far less from workers than from other political parties of the time. A corollary was that anarchism was also popular to the immigrant because most were escaping from the rigid class lines and controls over their lives that they had known in Italy and Iberia. To them, Brazil represented a truly new world where they could cease being unfree. Anarchism had been known to them in Europe, and it was a logical extension of their faulty immigrant working class prior knowledge. Now, of course, soon after they arrived there, they found out that the new world wasn't all that new. But these are things they had to learn after they got there. One thing that almost all immigrants to Brazil shared in common, however, was a Catholic background. While these anarcho-syndicalist immigrants rejected religion, they had nevertheless the cultural background of Catholicism. The anarchists who organized Brazil's labor movement, therefore, were drawn to anarchism. Now, they were used to having a conflicted relationship with Catholicism because they had it in Iberia, they had it in Italy. These are the two papist strongholds in all of Western Europe, right? So this is also the anarchist stronghold. So they were used to dealing with the hypocrisy of the Catholic Church. The anarchist agitators had to organize Brazil's poor, and at the same time they could accept that carnival, even though it was a distraction for the poor, was something they were going to have to live with. Like drinking and alcoholism, it was an inevitable contradiction to the best interest of workers. They had to constantly propagandize against, and that's how they accepted it. Well, we're used to this. The Catholics are always doing this kind of crap back home, so they're doing it over here. We know how we handle it there. We'll handle it here. And the way they handle it is by being temperance preachers, kind of like Mormons, or what they're doing here is the working class has a very tiny amount of potentially disposable income, and they spend it on alcohol, tobacco, football, movies, things like that. If you could cut that out altogether, the way the Mormons did, for example, well, all of it, and then you pull that all together, you got a lot of money here. You can buy land, you can buy supplies, you can build factories if you want to. There's all kinds of things you can do. The Mormons had proven that, and that's the whole reason for the Mormon abolition on tobacco and alcohol, for example. Now, what this meant in practice was your anarchist agitators had learned that the best thing they could do was to go out to these same masses and preach temperance to them the same way that Catholic priests taught them submission and obedience. And so they did that. I thought one of the most interesting things I ran across when I was studying this period for the purposes of these lectures was that one of the biggest debating topics of the time was Jesus Christ an anarchist? Now, the whole pitch, as you can probably imagine, is that Jesus Christ was much closer to us anarchists than he is to those bloated pigs in the Catholic hierarchy. And, of course, that was a line they could sell, because these workers from Iberia and Italy, they already knew the hierarchy were a bunch of bloated pigs. So that wasn't any surprise to them, something they were used to from back home. And on the other hand, the supposed message of Christ, assuming this guy ever lived, that's another question altogether, but assuming that there is some validity to the mythology, then you would say probably Jesus Christ was much more of an anarchist than he was of a pope. Well, at any rate, when militant labor organizers went out to the poor to speak of workers' rights and the great division between rich and poor, they presented their views just as Christians would. Same kind of speaking tones of voice, same kinds of meeting, same whipping up of these hysterical masses. The evangelical spirit and the conversion experiences were two traits that militant anarchists shared with Christian missionaries and preachers. What the anarchists opposed with all their strength, down to their last breath, was the horrible hypocrisy of the Catholic Church, a betrayal of the Catholic Church rank-and-file members who were also members of anarchist unions. Anarchist labor organizers in Brazil followed a strict code of conduct among themselves to set an example, and many of them opposed all forms of alcohol, tobacco, the eating of meat. The anarchists in Brazil fiercely attacked the church on many issues, including the church's refusal to promote or acknowledge any form of birth control. Brazilian anarchists thrashed the Catholic Church for allowing such madness as Carnival, claiming it was a waste of human life. In the words of one critic writing in the magazine Free Earth, Carnival is over and what's left to its own message of authority and hierarchy covered up in the illusion of a world for the meek. Okay, now, as I say, in this book so far, we've been talking about the oil and gas industry as the single most important thread to trace in the development of modern capitalism after the U.S. Civil War. Well, that is has an equivalent in the first 60 years after the American Revolution, and that is the spread of the telegraph. Now, 1862 marks the beginning of modern telegraphy in South America. The introduction of the telegraph in Brazil is contemporaneous with the war waged by the empire from 1851 to 1854 in defense of Uruguay against the Argentine dictator Rosas. According to the memory history, the Minister of Justice notified the director of semaphores. You remember, those are optical signals that you have to use a pair of binoculars or a telescope of some kind to see from one tower to the next. But if you got those towers close enough, you could send signals from one end of the European continent, for example, to the other real quickly. And this had great military importance. So, in 1851, he tells them that he wants to replace the optical telegraph with the then recently invented electric telegraph. In the same year, the Brazilian minister in Washington, D.C., Sergio Terreira de Macedo, transmitted to his home government a proposal by J.L. Leonard, a citizen of the United States, to interconnect various important cities in Brazil by electric telegraph line, and the telegraph connection by 1851 between Rio de Janeiro and the port of Mangaratiba had become imperative. Why imperative? Because slaves were being landed illegally. Now, this is in 1851, long before the 1888 abolition, in places that were not paying customs duties. And that was something that was upsetting to the government in Brazil. What they wanted, of course, was the same thing that the government in Buenos Aires had wanted, and that was always to have complete control of customs. Because that's the only place that you can put a tax and expect that it will be paid, because it has to be paid. Now, in Argentina, what had happened was that there was a federalist movement, because in the other great parts of Argentina, the powers that be wanted a piece of that customs action. And Buenos Aires always said no. So there was constant series of rebellions and wars. Well, the same thing was happening over slave importation in Brazil. These big slave owners like Calvin Candy would say, oh, I'm not going to pay that goddamn tariff and tax in New Orleans. I'm just going to bring them up here to some quiet little port we know about, Mississippi, and we'll unload them right there. So that was happening, and long before the abolition of slavery. So what Rio wants to do is put a stop to that, and in order to do that, they need to have an electric telegraph so they know when these ships are showing up with these illegal slave landings. The customs duty on slave importation was the major source of government revenue. and the slave plantation owners found it cheaper to avoid legal taxation by using alternative secret landing spots. To carry out this project, Eusebio Queiroz instructed Paula Candido, a professor at the School of Medicine, to build a short trial line between the police headquarters in the capital and the optical telegraph station on Castello Hill. Dr. Candido, with the assistance of Colonel Polidoro Fonseca, police commissioner, secured the loan of a telegraph apparatus from Dr. Schick de Capanema, professor of physics at the Escola Central. Now, a few days later, the colonel was really pissed off. He came back and he said, "Take this junk. This is no good. I tried it out. It doesn't work." But it turns out that the reason it didn't work is because he didn't set it up properly. And so he got the help he needed. He set it back up, and guess what? Right off the bat, he was able to set a signal to Rio about the illegal landing of a slave ship. And from then on, it was on the rise. This line, although constructed with cheap material, operated satisfactorily, and on May 11, 1852, telegrams were exchanged between the Emperor and Queiroz and Capanema, both stationed at military headquarters. This date is officially recognized as the date of the introduction of the telegraph in Brazil. So here we are, spring of 1852. Spring up here. Down there it's the beginning of fall. Anyway, 1852 to 1910. Now this is important because we are going to now see the news of the Russian revolutions, the 1905 revolution, the 1917, two revolutions in February and October, reaches Brazil instantly, as it did Argentina. You'll recall in 1874, Argentina had its first transatlantic cable connection directly to England. Now they're going to have a cable connection directly to Portugal. And I'm going to stop here for the moment because we've run out of tape apparently. I just want to point out that 1861, 9 years after the inauguration of the telegraph in Brazil in 1852, the total extension of telegraph line was about 40 miles, consisting of the Prenha-Petrópolis line of 50 kilometers and 15 kilometers within the city of Rio de Janeiro. And at that time there were 10 telegraph offices and 16 sets of telegraph apparatuses in the country. Now, what's going to happen is to make this feat important in terms of the revolutionary developments in Europe, we're going to have transatlantic cables. So we're going to see how that developed in the next one, in the next lecture, and then we'll go on and see what happened in the period after the formation of the Communist Party of Brazil.